that time that you spend with that specific recruiter who is prepared to invest their time in you, it's gold. And, stick with that recruiter.
You're a chef and you're thinking about how to venture into the private chef space, how to set yourself up for success from resume to first interactions with your clients, as well as succeeding at the job. Our one-on-one coaching got you covered. Go to www.privatechef.cc and connect with me. Decades of experience can be your support to seize the next private chef opportunity. Welcome to the Private Chef Podcast, serving the 1%. I'm your host, Hennche, and on our show we speak to the best chefs, how they honed in on their skills to excel in the industry, and what it takes to work as a private chef for some of the most exclusive clients in the world. Welcome to the Private Chef Podcast. I'm your host, Hannes Hennche. In this episode, we're joined by Scott Munden, the founder and president of Portico, a boutique recruiting firm renowned for its discerning placement of private service staff across North America and beyond. Today, Scott will share his insights from his over 30 years of invaluable expertise catering to high and ultra-high net worth families. We're excited to learn more about your journey and insights on recruitment and hiring processes. Welcome, Scott. It's a great pleasure to have you on the show.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, what was your original journey into private service like for yourself?
Well, I guess I can, answer that question sort of very quickly in a way I think that a lot of people who work in private service or private service recruiting would respond, which is almost by accident. It was not planned. I certainly, in my early years, had no idea that this thing called private service existed. I didn't know about the various positions in it. And so my first choice was to become an academic. From a very young age, I had this love for history, and I, was working my way through university and eventually became a teaching assistant for a British historian at a prominent Canadian university. And I was responsible for a class of 30 to help them. And I realized quickly that I don't think I really like teaching. And if you don't like teaching, academia is likely not the right career path for you. And then beyond that, as I became sort of deeply immersed in the department itself, I started to understand that you can be a really intelligent person and really be incredibly nasty as well. So, there's this whole genre of, fiction out there that is academic focused. And a lot of it's really true because it sort of delves into a lot of the nastiness that occurs. So I kind of pivoted towards, luxury hospitality. And I had always worked in that field as I went through university in order to support myself. So specifically, these were, high-end restaurants. And I didn't know it at the time. I had no idea, but that experience was helping me develop skills that I could put into my toolkit later on in life. So I was learning how to communicate with C-suite executives, with high and ultra high net worth individuals. If they were repeat, guests, which they often were, I came to know what their routines were, their likes, their dislikes. And so I was able to anticipate those. So I think that was appreciated from them, that, they didn't necessarily need to ask for things. I was able to anticipate those needs, those asks. And again, I think they liked that. Intuitively kind of picked up, when to be visible and when to be invisible. I also without realizing it, picked up on, as in very early stages, the importance of discretion. So, while a restaurant is a public environment, I recognized that at the table, this was a discrete environment. It was a bit of a bubble. And so, what I would hear and observe, at the table, needed to stay there. And, certainly, as fun as it was to listen to, a contemporary art collector talk about, art and, if they owned a gallery and their various relationships with artists around the world. I mean, that was a fringe benefit of the job and I loved it, but, it did need to stay, within that restaurant. So again, I didn't realize it, but all of these things that I was picking up, served me well as I eventually moved into private service. At some point, I was approached by an individual who had a startup that was based in Toronto, and and this is like going back 25, 26 years, and he was highly creative and thoughtful, and developed this concept of, I guess you could almost call it a household management concierge service. So today, there's lots of companies that do that, but in those days, there wasn't. And so he was incredibly creative, I thought. And, we together, along with this incredible team, behind us, grew that business from, a small Toronto based position with just Toronto clients to one that started to work around the world. So in the United States, in Europe, in the Middle East, and eventually in China and India and areas in Africa. And so it really became global in terms of reach. And we started to develop different lines of business as well. And one of them was recruiting. And so we had to, quickly establish, protocols for doing that. And the reason that we did that was we had clients who were constantly complaining, and this is, going back a bit. They were constantly complaining about recruiting agencies that just didn't get them.
Mm-hmm.
And they felt that we got them. And, they, always suggested that we move into that recruiting sphere, which we did, and we did very successfully. And it was this wonderful opportunity to get deeper into, private service and the various positions that exist within households. Everything from housekeepers and nannies to, private chefs, executive housekeepers, estate managers, and so on. And we did all of that. And it was 19 years of fun. Not everyday fun, because there is no such job. But, I never really believed that owning and operating and growing a business was a creative venture. My father always wanted me to go into business, and I thought, no, I'm not interested. And I eventually, came to understand, and this was, by the mentoring of my principal, who was a lot of fun to work with. If I had anxiety over a business idea, we would talk it through and I would walk out of his office completely reassured. So it was a good relationship. And I always shied away from business because I thought it's not creative, and I was so wrong. I realized relatively quickly that all of my creative muscles were required in order to grow that business. And
Mm-hmm.
so, again, I mean, we established, a household management school, which, I had to work with the entity that, controls and monitors, schools in, our jurisdiction. That was both difficult, a challenge, but also, I was able to, rise to that challenge. And as a company, we were able to rise to that challenge. But I think it was the recruiting side that I think is relevant, for today, for me. And 7 years ago, I decided to launch Portico. So I left that position in order to do this because I had a different idea. I thought, I wanted to create a boutique sized company. I realized that as I was developing my business plan, I deliberately had a strategy of keeping the business boutique size, which isn't necessarily an easy thing to do. Because I thought I have the experience of working for a company that started off small and we worked together to grow it into this large entity. And essentially, I reached the conclusion I didn't want to do it again. And so Portico is a company that exclusively does recruiting. So there are no other lines of business. And we work with a select, group of clients. We never really take on too many clients. And that's the tough part, is to keep the business small, because your temptation is always to want to take on more and more business.
Hmm.
And so yeah, it's tough saying, no, you need to be very diplomatic. You don't want to hurt people's feelings. And ultra high net worth individuals, they're not really used to hearing the word no.
Yeah.
They want to hear the word yes. And so, I needed to train myself. I have a friend who, has this expression, understand the power of no. And, that's something that I needed to train myself to understand. And it served me well. It keeps the business at a scale that I'm happy with.
And I think this is a interesting arc of life, is to eventually know what you want and what you would like to experience on a daily basis. As you said, not every day might be a happy day, but if you can create a life around yourself that serves the life you want to have, and part of that is learning how to say no. And it's like, hey, I see there's an opportunity here, but it's not where I would like to go, because I've kind of defined my roadmap here, and we're doing quite fine.
Yeah. And I think, connected with that is, I think keeping the business, at a scale that is boutique size gives me the opportunity to spend a lot of time with clients, candidates too.
Mhm.
But it really, helps me understand what their wants are, what their asks are, what their expectations are, what the ouch factor is that they're experiencing either now or in the past. And so what their fears are about maybe replicating mistakes that have been made in the past. And so that helps me. And also, if their expectations are what I would consider to be unrealistic or unmarketable, in a particular labor market, I'm not afraid to say so. I'd rather have those conversations in the beginning. And I do put a lot of focus on those early conversations so that I can make a good decision on whether to proceed with the client or not.
Mhm.
And if it's a not, I try my best to sort of part ways in a very sort of diplomatic, respectful way so that people don't feel that they're just being randomly dumped by me. I don't want that.
Yeah. Earlier, you mentioned there were clients who felt like other agents didn't get them. And what do you think is the distinction there between somebody who understands them deeply, so that you also understand the pain points, the ouch, and can make sure that that's being catered to with the new hire, versus somebody who maybe doesn't get them and just throws a bunch of resumes at them?
It's true. There are those recruiters out there, and there still are.
Yeah,
And
they.
so, I mean, and frankly, my business does not have a great reputation, and there are reasons for that. Perhaps we'll have an opportunity to talk about that a bit, because there's a part of me that would like to correct the record. But, I always say that private service recruiting is different from other sorts of recruiting. I've always thought, okay, I can teach recruiting relatively easy, but there is no university where someone can go in and learn about private service and what it means to work in, someone's household. Yes, there are schools that spend 2, 3, 4, maybe 6, 8 weeks with someone. And the objective is to, give them, certain skills and information so that they can hopefully, transition into the private service field. But it's that second piece. And I think this is where clients, determine whether the agent gets them or not. So I've always thought, okay, I can teach recruiting. I can't teach private service. It's something that needs to be experienced. But if you're going to engage with ultra high net worth individuals, they demand a lot. They want a lot of knowledge from the individual. So I always think that private service recruiters need to understand recruiting and best practices, and be able to follow protocols that are shared with clients. But more importantly, I really believe they have to have that experience in terms of private service. So if they've worked in households, and a lot of recruiters today have that experience, I think that's fantastic. And I think they can speak very intelligently with clients and are able to determine, what is a realistic position that is marketable versus an unrealistic one, and have an open and intelligent conversation with those clients. And I think at the end of the conversation, hopefully the client will get a feeling, a sense of confidence that yes, this recruiter gets me. They understand what my ouch is. They understand where I want to go in terms of my household. And again, some recruiters are able to deliver that, and I think there's a whole lot that are not able to deliver that.
Mm. Yeah. Initially, even from a chef's perspective, like reaching out to the first couple agencies, you can have all kinds of interesting experience. There are those who literally just collect and throw resumes at the client.
Yeah.
And then eventually you notice that there is agents who actually take time if they can, who have a boutique size maybe operation where they can speak to individuals and where those individuals also feel heard to some degree. But then obviously there is that factor where for each client you probably have 100 resumes potentially of people who would like to.
I wish.
Well, it's more not that all of them are qualified, but it's like
Yeah.
there's like so many people who would potentially want to get the job, but probably 70% of them send in their resume who are not qualified, and then you kind of
Yeah.
have to give your time to those who are relevant to each individual position, which makes the majority of people eventually feel like, okay, why do I never hear back from the agencies?
I've always thought that, individuals who work in private service or want to enter the field, as opposed to spreading themselves so thin and blanketing the recruiting market with their resumes, really need to kind of align themselves with maybe two, possibly three recruiters. And when I'm saying that, I'm not saying, aligning themselves with an agency, but with a specific individual,
Mhm.
and develop a relationship with them that hopefully, lasts for years. I mean, it's one of the things that, I aim to do. If I, particularly if, I really like the individual, I think, hey, this is someone who I want to develop a relationship with that hopefully will last for a very long period of time. And I'm constantly checking in with them, or they're checking in with me. And sometimes those conversations are about work. And sometimes they're just about, random stuff, a movie they saw or a television show that they're watching. I just watched the first episode of The Bear last night, and it's a beautiful episode if you haven't seen it. So I highly recommend it. I don't know how you feel about the show, but I love it. And so I just think that it's a bit of a failure to just throw your resume everywhere. I think it dilutes you as a candidate. But if you can target, those recruiters, and you feel that sort of, connection with them, and they in turn feel a connection with you, that leads to good things. And I think, those recruiters are able to advocate for you. Hopefully, they're able to learn about, your hopes and dreams about where you want to go in terms of your career, and remember that. And so when these jobs come along, reach out to you and say, last conversation, you said you were looking for this. Well, guess what? I mean, this family is looking for just that. So, yeah, try to focus those relationships. Don't spread yourself too thin.
Yeah, I think this is also where, having relationship with somebody who knows you, it makes such a difference. Like if you're just a number in a system, a resume that pops up and goes again, and nobody really knows, what your ambition is or what your experience is on a deeper level, or
Yeah.
what it is like to maybe at least speak to you on a 30-minute Zoom call or something to get an idea of what you're all about. Obviously they will never advocate for you in an interview process.
No, because they won't know how. And, I think, one of the things that, I know that you've talked about with other people is, how do you enter private service. If you're a private chef and you've never done that before, how do you enter that? And that's where relationships with a recruiter that is willing to spend the time with you and make recommendations about, okay, so these are the things that I think you need to do in order to position yourself so that you are attractive to a family. You may not have experience working as a private chef, but you've done certain things that position you well so that a family will reach a conclusion and be prepared to roll the dice and think, okay, well, he doesn't or she doesn't check off all of the private chef boxes, but been doing a lot of work on themselves to prepare themselves and ready themselves for this kind of job. And guess what? We like them. They're smart and we like them. And likability, it's so key. I mean, it's not anything obviously that can be taught. You're either likable to someone or you're not, and not everyone is going to like us. But yeah, and I get again, just going back to your point, I think that time that you spend with that specific recruiter who is prepared to invest their time in you, it's gold. And stick with that recruiter because they'll serve you well.
Yeah. So, what are some of the key things that you just maybe thought about, like what somebody can pick up that would potentially stand out, but also keeping in mind that their resume is not quite there yet to be like the perfect candidate, but helps to get their foot in the door?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it'll vary from position to position, but generally speaking, I mean, I'm asked that question all the time. And, I mean, I think in my experience, I mean, certainly personal experience, but also in terms of speaking with people who are in private service and asking them, how did they get into the field? Invariably, the response is by accident. And I
Very
think there's
intentional.
truth to that. It's true. It's true. But that said, when you dig a little deeper, there's stuff that they did along the way that, led them to private service. And I think I talked a little bit about that when I was talking about, my career trajectory and, working in restaurants and work and spending a lot of time with back of house and,
Yeah.
learning about what it is that they do. So, in terms of preparing yourself for private service, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do, but there are some things that you can do. So, when people ask me the question, there's certain go tos that, I'll give the person. So, for example, align yourself or get enrolled with a wait staff company that specifically works in the homes of high and ultra high net worth families, because that experience will allow you to actually meet people who work in those homes, and so you'll be able to understand the various positions and how they interact with their employers. And if you're smart, you'll be paying attention to all of those things. You'll learn about how to set a table because it's so different than a restaurant, how to serve at a table, how to, serve wine, which is entirely different from working in a restaurant. And hopefully, maybe how to decant wine, how to, read labels properly, how to set a fireplace, how to set up a catering bar, how to make basic cocktails. So, waitstaff company, great, do it. Why not? I also think that, not that, I expect, people working in private service to be sommeliers, but maybe a bartending course is a good idea so that you learn how to make basic cocktails. Hopefully, maybe they integrate a bit of, wine knowledge in there. So you learn about, different wine regions and, the difference between a Burgundy and a Bordeaux. And you learn about Italian wines in the various regions and New World wines. And you learn a little bit about wine and food pairings so that if you're a house manager and you are tasked with planning and organizing and executing a dinner party event and you're working with the private chef in order to do that, you have the skills, you have the language, in order to interact with the private chef in an intelligent way. And then in turn, also speak with, the employer in in an intelligent way as well. And hopefully, the event, goes off successfully. So I do think that, that's important. In the same way, I think maybe taking some culinary classes, again, you learn things. I mean, just in the same way that, I was learning by, interacting with back of house and in terms of restaurants and, speaking with people who worked on the line and then escaping the mayhem of the line and going into the pastry kitchen, which was this oasis of calmness that I welcomed. All of that stuff, I mean, at the time you may not think is important, but if you have a strategy in place and you just itemize the things that you need to do and you check it off bit by bit by bit, you will eventually meet that employer that goes, okay, so the resume doesn't identify, the experience that we're looking for, but we do recognize that this person has, put in the effort to learn, these various skills. So they've been doing, their self-improvement work, and we like them. We think they're smart. They're smart because they've recognized that they've needed to do all of this work. We're prepared to roll the dice. Sure, there'll be a learning curve, but we think and we have confidence in this person that they'll be able to, get over that hoop or get through that hoop rather. And so there will be people who are prepared to roll the dice. There's not a lot of them, but they're out there. And you just need to find them. And a good recruiter will help you find them.
Sorry for the interruption. We will be right back. And if you're a chef thinking about venturing into the private chef space, this is for you. We coach you on how to set yourself up for success, from resume to first interactions with your clients, as well as succeeding at the job. Our one-on-one coaching got you covered. Go to www.privatechef.cc and connect with me. Decades of experience can be your support to seize the next private chef opportunity. So what makes the distinction with the family who are willing to roll the dice, as you said, versus the ones who are not? Is it that people who just came to money who are fine with having somebody with less experience? Or is it people that actually already went through a couple of chefs and think that they can form someone else maybe differently if they pick them up early in their career?
It's an interesting question. I think that hmm, I think that older families will definitely want someone with private chef experience. It will be a deal breaker for them. It's not a wish list item; it's a deal breaker, and that's fine. I perfectly respect that because they have had experience with private chefs, and maybe they have experience hiring a chef from a restaurant, and it was a disaster. Just because those are two very different environments, and some people can make the transition and others just can't, and never will be able to. So I think maybe there might be some demographic considerations there. So my experience, established families who have had private chefs, that's what they want. They want, someone who has proven experience as a private chef, ideally, perhaps in homes that they're already familiar with. And so they can enter into that relationship with confidence. There are other people who, will say our preference is someone with a private chef background. Secondary, if they have worked as personal chefs and, have done events for families, so they're not there on a regular basis, but they have worked in private kitchens or, caterers. Again, maybe not the first choice, but as a second choice, if we like them. And again, I keep sort of going back to that likability word, because I do think it's important that they will be willing to roll the dice. I've been working recently, just because there's been such demographic change in terms of my clientele, and I think a lot of recruiters would probably say the same, just because there's been such an incredible transfer of wealth over the last 10 years from an older generation to a younger generation, who the wealth may have been transferred, but the knowledge and information that their parents have may not have been. And so maybe they're more open to, hiring someone who doesn't directly come from a private chef background, and just look for the qualities, the character traits that will be successful in a private kitchen. And a lot of that has to do with, how do they work? Are they kitchen warriors where they're tossing pots and pans all over the place, or do they work in a disciplined, quiet, focused way? That's a characteristic, or a series of characteristics, that I think work really well in a private home.
Hmm. I think cleanliness is big. Like,
Oh gosh, sorry, I forgot that. Yeah, that's a big one. Clean as you go.
I remember when I was transitioning out and I helped the family find their next chef. And a couple of the candidates, they left like an oil film in the kitchen, and the family was just like shocked. I'm like, how could anybody do that?
Every household is different. I mean, it's something I've learned over the years, is that you can't, throw households into a single bucket. You really do need to spend time, in those initial stages, to understand the idiosyncrasies of that household, because they exist. And so, I've had clients who basically will make the case that a chef will never clean a kitchen as well as a housekeeper will. And then on the other hand, I have clients that, their kitchens are, meticulous. And if a chef isn't properly cleaning the bottom of a pan, that's a deal breaker for them. I mean, the dinner might have been excellent, but if they're not, properly cleaning, their pots and pans, and by that, I'm not referring just to the interior, I'm referring to the entire
Yeah.
pot and pan.
It's so funny, as you're speaking, I can literally go through my experience, where some of the principals, they have the housekeepers literally scrub every single pan and polish it, and it's supposed to look like, you just bought it.
Yeah. And it can be done, except that, I mean, again, we go back to the difference between someone who has worked as a private chef, and sometimes they have a lot of support behind them. And, the housekeepers will be tasked with, making sure. I mean, the private chef may do, a clean as you go, a tidy up, and then the housekeeper steps in and does the real cleaning. And that relationship is perfectly acceptable to the family, whereas other families really want all of that from the chef. So if they're coming from the restaurant world, where there is this huge support network, and they're moving into a private home where they're wearing all of the hats, everything from, the dish pit to, the expediter, and it's just a different, situation. And again, some people are really good at it. I mean, some people have incredible eye for detail. I will say that, as I'm interviewing chefs, invariably all of them will say that, I mean, keeping a clean kitchen is absolutely important to them. But whether they follow through on that, not necessarily.
But sometimes it's also circumstance.
Yeah.
The term cleanliness and OCD, there's a
Oh.
it's I know that I've met some families, and especially maybe the females of the household, where it was beyond cleanliness that they wanted. They wanted their kitchen to look absolutely meticulous, even in the process of cooking. And the fridge, for example, itself was supposed to be like a bespoke piece of art that at any time you open it just speaks to them, and the berries sit perfectly organized, and the cherries, like they're jumping out to them. And I'm like, that's fine, but you can't quite expect me to have like my actual mise en place fridge to be that same display fridge at any
Yeah.
moment during the day.
Yeah.
Like if I'm preparing for a party or if I'm in the middle of serving a multi-course dinner, I will need cooling space that's functional and not just bespoke presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just because, a family decides that they want a private chef doesn't mean that they understand how a private chef works and what they need. I've encountered, families that basically think a private chef, well, they're responsible for lunch and dinner. What more do they need to do? And, on the other hand, I was speaking with a client a few weeks ago who, I mean, and this would have been their first private chef, but they were smart enough to understand that in a busy city with a lot of construction where it's very difficult to get from point A to point B, that provisioning can take 3 hours. And that's not an exaggeration. Believe you're in New York. And so it's not a fast thing and it eats up a lot of the chef's time.
Yeah.
And so, if dinner is a slow braise, and they're having to do marketing too, and they're having to, organize the fridge. And I always love, if I'm able to, I love opening up those refrigerators and just having a look because, I find beauty in odd things. And that's one area that I find beauty, but I'm an odd duck. And maybe that's why I'm a recruiter. I don't know. But yeah, you are right. I think that some families are really, and maybe, it's the families who have, greater experience and families who don't, although this woman was an exception, are the ones that really, have unrealistic expectations in terms of a chef. And that's why it's important that these initial conversations with clients be longer and deeper and really, go into, what the ask is and what the expectations are and, gives me an opportunity to respond to them, hopefully in a constructive way.
hmm Yeah, what you just mentioned, especially about the time spent provisioning marketing, I think oftentimes it's something that the principal might feel like, what are they doing all day? We're like, where are they? And then a good chunk of it, you're just maybe stuck in New York City traffic, or you're like standing in line at their favorite grocery store because they send you there at a time that didn't really make sense. And this is something that they might not take into consideration, but which might cost you an hour of your day.
It's so true. Or your car broke down. I mean, there's so many factors that go into, what a private chef does, or for that matter, any sort of position. I mean, I used to go through the exercise of, let's take housekeepers, for example, where, the family building, this job description that just went on and on and on. And I tend not to respond to these situations immediately. I'm a bit of a processor and I will take the information that I've gathered. And usually, because I used to train housekeepers, so I know how long it takes to, clean, an average sized bathroom or, a bedroom or to, clean a refrigerator and reorganize it and get rid of, expired items. And I would tabulate the day to day and I would attach, times. It was usually 15-minute increments. And, eventually, and I would share that with families. And if they saw that those days were 12, 13, 14 hours, clearly that's not a realistic position. And hopefully the client has a bit of an aha moment. They may question me in terms of, why I think it takes, this amount of time to, clean a bathroom or to reorganize a fridge. And, hopefully I have a good answer for that. But I do, think that the exercise is a bit of an eye opener. I've always kind of believed that, in some respects, wealth means that, an individual or a family lives in a kind of bubble. And, as a recruiter, I'm never afraid to maybe just sort of pierce the bubble a little bit with a piece of information And, again, trying to sort of, introduce the other things that a private chef does is that opportunity to pierce that bubble with a bit, or just a bit. And sometimes, the individual or the family will respond with an aha, I didn't realize that. You're absolutely right. And so we need to make an adjustment. Or there will be those families that go, tough. This is what we want. This is what we expect. And frankly, between you and I, although I know it's not between you and I, try to avoid those families. I'm at this point in my career, I'm able to do that, fortunately. And, really focus on, the families that are open to at least listening. They may not go with my advice, and I'm
Hmm.
fine with that. But if they listen and understand, I think I can work with these people and I think I can be successful with them. So I do look for those things. And, it's not, I kind of want to go back to this sort of bubble thing for a second, because it's no one's fault. I just think it is, a product of, living in a particular world and meeting particular people who may be of your same economic class. And it tends to sort of reinforce that bubble. And then I do think, a good, confident recruiter will be able to sort of, introduce, well, this part of the job is perfectly fine, but I think you're off track here. And then just see how the family responds.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think if, for example, what you mentioned earlier, if the incremental times add up to 13, 14-hour days and the family just shrugs it off, then you already know that your candidates will not be taken care of, that that will not lead to longevity.
No, and frankly, I mean, candidates aren't stupid. I mean, if they've worked in the field, they know how long things take. And so, if I'm presenting that job, and I need to hold my head high in the market. I don't want, people and my candidates to think that I am, presenting over and over and over again these jobs that are completely unrealistic. I want, to be able to present marketable positions. I mean, they may not be right for everyone, but they might be right for, a select group of people. And yeah, I mean, they put two and two together and they're able to recognize, those problem positions or problem, it's a negative word, but just something that's not, doable, that they won't succeed at.
Hmm.
And no one wants to fail. They want to enter a job and, be successful. And, people, generally speaking, true professionals that work in private service, they take a lot of pride in what they do. And I think that's a wonderful thing to hear. And so you do want to set them up for success. And so part of that is about having those real conversations with clients so that the position can be set up for long term success.
Yeah. Earlier you mentioned that with the previous companies, you guys were literally active on every continent. Like, and you mentioned India and Africa and China there. And I wonder what is the difference in those markets? And I mean, I spend a lot of time in India, and it's a very different dynamic in service, and private service is available to even the middle class in a way that we don't quite understand over here. So I wonder
Yeah.
what the dynamics are like in those markets, even the Middle East, maybe compared to what we are used to in the United States, which I think is honestly the most privileged private service market in the world.
Oh, I would agree. I mean, all you need to do is look at the salaries,
Yeah.
and I'm always shocked. I mean, I do have, a recruiter friend who works in the U.S., and if there's a job that's come along, I will try to get that second opinion on salary, and I'm always shocked. It's very, very different than, let's say, Canada or, you know, the United Kingdom. And, there's lots of complaints about salaries in the United Kingdom because they're comparing them to, other positions.
I mean,
So
London living expenses are just as high as New York. It's just the
it
salary is
is.
half.
I know. And I mean, again, I don't really understand why a recruiter would choose not to say to a client that that's not a reasonable salary. I live in a very expensive city. And so if a client is asking, and we're kind of getting off track of your question, and I apologize for this, but if a client is asking a housekeeper, for example, that they have to own a car, and, be willing to use it for work purposes. Well, the reality is that owning a car in a city like the one I live in is a very, very expensive thing. And, even in terms of housing, housekeepers are being pushed out further and further away from their places of work. And so it takes them longer and it costs them more to get to work. And so all of that needs to be, explained in terms of working in other markets. There's Yeah, for sure there's cultural differences, and you need to learn them, and you need to learn them rather quickly. And I mean, I'll say it, I mean, there are some jurisdictions that I am very happy to work in, and then there are others where it's like, not so sure about working there, just because the reputation, and it is a generalization. There will always be, good jobs with good families, regardless of, where they happen to live on the planet. But there is such a thing as cultural differences and how, private service individuals are treated. And, I mean, and a lot of that, I mean, if they're hiring a European, they're treated differently than if they're hiring someone from elsewhere in the globe. Is that fair? Absolutely not. I don't want to get into it, but I have seen some horror stories, and I thought, I don't want to go back there.
Mm,
And again, you need to learn these things, and you need to learn them quickly. And you just make the determination, is this a market that I want to work in or not? And then also in the back of your mind, you always need to remember you can't generalize. There will always be exceptions. I don't care if I mean, there are nightmare jobs anywhere. I mean, they exist everywhere. And I mean, people also need to understand that. And so you have to look for those good jobs. You have to look for those good families, those good organizations.
yeah. And I think this is really what it boils back down to is having the willingness to be patient and going through different interviews, different trials with different families, and also having the clarity of what works for oneself. And like, okay, this is a client that I can see myself working for because they're conducting their household a certain way. I see that the team has been here for some time. They seem to be also welcoming for new team members. It's not one of those legacy teams that is maybe rejecting new team members. So that there's a certain dynamic that one picks up on in the interview and the trial period that one can see themselves in.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think that, I mean, there's always sort of warning signs, as I'm speaking with a client. There's warning signs when I'm speaking with candidates, but one of them is, oh, we're really great with our staff and we treat them very well. And our previous, house manager was with us for 15 years, and they really do hard work at making me believe that they are these wonderful employers. And I will say that if you need to work that hard at making me reach the conclusion that you're these really wonderful employers, there may be potential that that's not so much the case. And so, again, I think it comes with experience that that that's a bit of a red flag. Yeah. So,
On the flip side, what are the red flags for the candidates where they're maybe re-emphasizing a little bit too strongly on something?
yeah, I mean, so, my interview style is, and I kind of touched on this, highly conversational. I just feel that people open up more. I learn more about them. It's an opportunity to learn all about their soft skills as opposed to the hard skills that are on the resume that, are easily identified. But there are red flags that I look for, and some of them are going to be really quirky, and I'll have some fun talking about the quirky stuff. But in terms of, red flags, obviously, I want to make sure that the individual knows what it is that they're applying for. So if they're coming in for an interview and they still haven't spent time studying that job description, it's a problem. I mean, to me, it means that, they're a bit, sloppy in terms of, how they're preparing themselves for an important interview. It's a bit disrespectful, right? I mean, if I'm putting the effort into, a job description that I think is very comprehensive, and we've had this conversation where I'm able to answer questions that maybe not in the job description, and they still don't quite get it, that's a bit of a red flag. If they're not able to speak about their resume in a cohesive, comprehensive way, and there are, contradictions or inconsistencies, or they're very evasive about something, that's a red flag. How do they present themselves? And so, manners are so important in private service. I don't care what the position is, it matters. And I know, that, particularly, people who come from, different cultures, they have different manners. And so, I mean, adjusting to a different culture is a challenge. And so I'm sensitive to that. And so do I rule those people out? Absolutely not. Do I think that they're going to be on a learning curve? Yeah. I do. So that would be, one of the things that I would be looking for. I always ask situational questions. And so one of my favorite is, about conflict, and I like people to get relatively specific about it, and what the nature of the conflict was, and whether it was resolved, and if so, how was it resolved. I know, it's kind of a bit of a boilerplate question, but I like to really spend a lot of time there.
Hmm.
Gosh, there's others, and it's sort of escaped me right now. But I'll get to the quirky stuff. And so I don't know. I love to look at hands. And I learn a lot by looking at hands. And that is going to sound very weird, but it's also very practical. So if, I am recruiting for a housekeeper who I know is going to spend a lot of time with laundry, and there's a lot of hand washing, and they have beautifully manicured hands,
Yeah.
I probably am going to reach the conclusion that they're going to not really want to be doing a lot of hand washing. Now, I might be wrong about that. But I'm likely right. So that's one thing. The other thing, and this is going to sound maybe really odd, but I want to see how the person leaves the interview table. And so, in other words, they're leaving their chair. I want to see them lift the chair and put it back towards the interview table. I don't want to see them see the chair dragged. I don't want to see the chair rubbing up against the table. I want to see it sort of bit about an inch away from the table. And so these are, I mean, it's for me, I know it's kind of quirky,
No,
but
but
for
I think
me,
this one, even as you were saying it, I'm like, oh my God, this is stuff I look at home. Like, and maybe that's the private service professional in me, where I'm like, there's a certain way that I put the chair back to the table, and I always hope that the people in who visit or some would do it in a certain manner too. It's
yeah,
like,
I know it's true. And so, I pick up on that stuff. I mean, is it deal breaker things for me? No. I mean, it's not necessarily that high on my priority list, but it's there. And I do pay attention to these things. And for me, it just comes down to attention to detail, and whether the person is aware of it. And so these are one of the clues, that give me an idea of whether this person has attention to detail or not.
yeah. And I think bringing it all together, it's really about imbibing and being a private service professional. It's like, have you had the overall experience, whether that's in a Michelin star restaurant or in a very good hotel, or Have you been in this environment where attention to detail was demanded and it was paramount to know when to speak, when not to speak, know how to move furniture pieces when other people are around, how to keep the ambience undisturbed while doing the work you have to do?
Yeah. No, it's very true. I mean, it's such a different world. And that's why I say, again, just going back to a previous point about, recruiters and me being able to teach recruiting, but private service is something that you really need to experience and spend, time, in those environments so that you understand, all of those nuances. And they are nuances. I mean, to an outsider, they may seem, frivolous and silly, and yet in a private home, they actually do matter. And employers will pay attention to those kinds of
Yeah. Well, Scott, this has been very, very interesting. Where can
things.
people connect with you, reach out to you?
So, website, porticostaff.com. So, that's one way. Also, pretty active on LinkedIn, which is turning into a very interesting site these days. So that's one way, obviously, by telephone. I mean, I can give you the number, but it's also on the website.
Great. Thank you so much for your time.
I want to thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us at the Private Chef podcast. If you know any highly skilled chefs that want to take their life to the next level, make sure to share this podcast with them. And if you enjoyed this episode, click subscribe and check out our upcoming episodes. Thank you for listening.